morning, at least I hope it's morning. This is Brock Rule, speaking to you from Kansas City. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. There was a personal matter I had to tend to. I thought maybe recording this and sending it through YouTube might be the next best thing to help out. Let's see if it works. A little introduction. As I said, my name is Brock Rule. I'm with Hopkins Appraisal. We're a national firm that specializes exclusively in valuing gas stations and restaurants. That's all we do. We can value real estate or business or both. As I said, we're national. We've got 40 appraisers and 12 offices. We cover the whole country. We get to almost all 50 states every year. We'll appraise one store anywhere, but we also do a lot of work with portfolios. 100 stores is a routine part of our workflow. And to properly value this going concern property types that we live with, you need some expertise, not in just real estate, but also in business valuation. I have an MAI for real estate and also have an ASA for business valuation. And I really enjoy working with the Society of Chief Appraisers and really appreciate the hard work that Stuart and Brenda and Alan put into this and everybody else who helps. And it's really, I think I do about 10 of these a year now with the Society, and this is the middle of my third lap of America. This is the second time for New York. Last year we were on Park Avenue. That was an amazing event if you were there. And when I visit a city the first time with the Society, we talk about how to value a gas station. And the second time through, we do restaurants. And so here today we'll talk about restaurants. But I did want to kind of back up for a minute and talk about and review quickly a topic that was important to the gas station discussion. If you remember, if you were there last year, there was a fellow from the Port Authority who put on a very compelling presentation, and at the end of it, he kind of went on what he called a personal thing, and he talked about climate change and showed Lower Manhattan underwater. And since I'm in the gas station business and that's my fault, I thought I'd talk about a topic relative to that I think most people are interested in. Demand destruction. That's a term in the industry that popped up a few years ago when the Obama administration increased the corporate average fuel economy standards. And they increased them rapidly. If I remember, twice, once kind of in the middle of that administration and once right near the end. And that was, I believe, kind of the beginning of the term demand destruction. And with the rise of Tesla and Uber, we're all going to be in electric self-driving cars and we won't need a gas station anymore. So I thought we could address that here. If you believe in demand destruction, on the left-hand side we have points in favor of that worldview. Another point in that favor is governments are talking about banning gasoline-powered cars. Here's a list of some countries that have said that. California didn't want to be left out, and so some of the politicians there have expressed a desire to head in that direction. I think the leader in this way is China. China, they have some real pollution problems, if you remember, around the Olympics, and they also want to be technologically leading, so this is probably a natural way to do that, or to express that desire. One thing about these quote-unquote bans is that, to my knowledge, nobody's proposing to come and take a car out of your garage. There's some future date at which you can't buy a new, this is the idea, you can't buy a new gasoline-powered car. The installed base will still persist and work itself out over time. That out date, it seems to be for everybody's 2040. I know that at the beginning of this year, California, the legislature did not take up this idea and has tabled it. So that, for the time being, is not on the table. Auto manufacturers, there are a number of manufacturers, and I've listed some here, who said, hey, in the future, all of our cars will be electric, or all of the models in our lineup will have an all-electric option. And the thing to remember here is that to the extent of this governmental action is going to drive this, The governments don't have to be rational from an economic or even environmental standpoint. We as market analysts and economists think in those terms, but the politicians don't necessarily have to. Or maybe they have broader definitions of the economy. Their currency may be votes. Their definition of fair market value may lean more on fairness and social goods, but economically, environmentally, they can do what we would consider maybe irrational things. The counterpoint, do electric vehicles really improve the environment? Well, I was in Seattle last time with the Society of Chief Appraisers, and they generate their electricity up there substantially, I believe, with hydroelectric power. Yeah, probably. That an electric vehicle is, from an emissions standpoint, probably a good thing with hydro-generated electricity. But if you're like most of the country with coal-generated, you're just moving the emissions from the tailpipe to the smokestack, and there may be not as much gain there as hoped. And speaking of environmental, if you want to depress yourself, Google images for cobalt mining, and you'll see a bunch of little kids crawling out of smoking holes in the ground with baskets on their head, carrying heavy loads of dirt, and they're cobalt mining. Cobalt has been called the gasoline of the future because it's a critical element in these electric batteries. Economically, nobody's making money on selling electric vehicles, and that's even after a bunch of government subsidies for it. But here I think is the main point about this topic is there's a massive installed base of gasoline-powered cars. There are 270 million cars in the U.S. Last year we sold 17 million cars. And does anybody know how many electric vehicles were sold in 2017 in America? The answer is about 150,000. Less than 1% of the new cars sold were electric vehicles. And 150,000 is a small number against 17 million, and the total installed base of electric vehicles in the U.S. is about 500,000, and that's a really small number against 270 million total. So here is some industry predictions on the future fuels. The U.S. Energy Information Agency, a federal agency, says that in 2040, for transportation, 88% of the energy will be liquid. That's gas and diesel. The Fuels Institute, which is an affiliate of the National Association of Convenience Stores, they may have a bias, in other words. They think in 2025, the number or the market share for electric vehicles in new sales will be 8%. As I said, now it's less than 1%. IHS Markit, which is an unaffiliated group, so far as I know, says in 2025 that the fleet will be 73% gasoline powered. At that time now it's at 70%. So here are the demand curves. I've seen several. This is typical. Green and yellow are gas and diesel. And because of increasing population in miles driven, the absolute number of gallons of gas and diesel dispensed will go up even if their share is declining because the pie is getting bigger. And then this chart shows in 2035 that the demand starts to level out. All right, so it's going to be a while. There's a lot of confusion about this, and it doesn't really matter what I think or what you think. Valuation multiples for gas stations right now are at all-time highs. That's Mr. Market. Mr. Market's speaking, and for the moment the market does not see demand destruction as being a relevant factor. Or maybe the market says, there's no reason why a gas station can't be a charging station, and that these things live on good corners and there's going to be some kind of retail activity on them no matter what the particular technological or consumer trend is at the moment. So I wanted to cover that for a couple of reasons, and I hope you found that to be of some interest. Let's get back to restaurants, okay? How do you value a restaurant going concern? Well, you just need three numbers. And this is what we learned from market participants. If you ask a market participant, you go to a trade show, which we do 15 or 20 a year, and you say, what are you worth? The restaurant operator will say 5 times. I say, okay, do you own your real estate? And the operator will say, yes. That's 8% capped at 7%. You need three numbers, which is a business multiple, a rent factor, and a real estate cap rate. That's how you value a restaurant going concern. If you're a visual learner like me, this is the money slide. EBITDA is the business NOI. We'll define that in a minute. Don't worry about that weird term. What you do is you take the business NOI and you put it into two piles. On the right-hand side, we have R for rent. On the right-hand side of this chart, we're valuing the real estate. We take some of the income, carve it off as rent, we cap it to get a real estate value. The part of the income left is associated with the business, and we apply a business multiple to it, and we value the business. And the value of the going concern is the sum of the business and the real estate. This is an excess earnings technique. The ASAs call this an excess earnings technique. The excess is the cash flow servicing the business after the tangibles have been paid for. As a general commercial appraiser, I could relate to this through the band of investment. In the band of investment, we slice the income into two pieces, debt and equity, and apply valuation factors to those two income streams. It's the same with the restaurants. We split the income into two piles and we apply different capitalization factors and sum them up. So what's EBITDA? EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and rent. It's an accounting term. You and I can think of it as business NOI, as I said. Wall Street refers to this as operating cash flow. Before interest means this is before debt service. Before taxes, those are income taxes, not real estate taxes. Depreciation, of course, is about capital expenditures. Amortization is a special kind of depreciation for intangible assets. And before rent means we're in a fee simple position. Okay, before rent means we're not paying rent, means we own our real estate, means we're in a fee simple position. In our parlance, we're precise to distinguish between EBITDA and EBITDA. EBITDA is not before rent, it's after rent. We're paying rent. That means we don't own our real estate. We're a leaseholder. Now that lease may be a ground lease or a facility lease. A facility lease encompasses the land and the building, but in either case, we're a leaseholder to some extent. EBITDA, in our BVAL practice, we appraise a lot of rolled up companies where some stores are owned in fee and some are leased. The parentheses means we've got a mix of both. Okay, consistency is the key thing in all of capitalization. We need to be consistent in how we define our terms. Okay, general and administrative, that's overhead, G&A. If you own 50 restaurants, you have a back office. And in the back office, you have all your accounting, all your payroll, all your HR. And you can allocate that to the individual stores as a percent of sales or as a flat number per store, however you want to do it. But when we define EBITDA, we need to say whether that's pre or post G&A. Capital expenditures. Okay, coming from a general commercial background, this is the first 15 years of my career. I was a general commercial appraiser, and when I learned the franchise business, gas stations from Hopkins, nobody took a reserve for replacement, and that bugged me. Okay, this presentation in an article I wrote in the Appraisal Journal about valuing restaurants is a little bit about my journey from general commercial to specialist, and this is one of my stumbling blocks. What about the CapEx, man? Where's the reserve? Well, as long as you're consistent, it doesn't really matter, right? And so the consistent view here in these markets, the market participants don't take a reserve for replacement. All right, EBITDA margins, just by the way, in a quick service restaurant or a full service restaurant tend to be about 20% of net sales on a pre-G&A, pre-CapEx reserve basis. Okay? EBITDA margin is 20% of sales. How do you pick a rent? Well, there are 3 ways to pick a rent. Our first step, remember, to value the real estate is pick a market rent. One way is to look at comps. We analyze those on a per square foot basis, but if I'm appraising a Taco Bell, all my comps are Taco Bells. They all tend to be about the same size. And you quickly realize the annual dollar amount is more important than the per square foot amount. Here's another thing. This market also look at rent to sales ratios and rent coverage ratios. Rent as a percent of sales should be about 8%. Rent coverage, you've heard of debt service coverage before. Debt service coverage ratios are NOI divided by debt service. Rent coverage ratios are EBITDAR divided by R, a similar thing. So here's a picture of me. When I first learned this, I was frustrated. I said, this is not right. You can't use rent to sales ratios and, heaven forbid, rent coverage ratios because you're getting the business in your real estate. That is wrong. You know, my dad was an MAI, and this is not how I was raised. Okay, I was taught to fear business income and to manipulate rent only. If you're a Ghostbusters fan, you can't cross your streams. This is bad. All right. Well, I actually had the gumption or arrogance, I don't know, to write an article in a restaurant finance publication that said, you all are doing it wrong. When I learned this, I said, hey guys, don't do this. You're getting business in your real estate. You should be doing a cost approach, blah, blah, blah. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. For decades, for thousands of properties and billions of dollars, that market had been transacting this way, and they didn't need my permission. It was humbling and embarrassing. And when I got my head straight, what I realized, the purpose of a rent-to-sales ratio wasn't to screw somebody in a sale-leaseback. The purpose was to make sure I could afford my rent. If I'm going to sign a 20-year lease, I want to be able to afford it over that long period of time. That's where these ratios come from. Okay, it's worse. Not only are rent-to-sales and rent coverage used, they're much more important than comps. The rent comps that we collect as general commercial appraisers are just brackets. They set the curbs of the extreme high and extreme low. That's where they really become relevant. What are rent to sales ratios? Well, they are in the broad range of 6% to 8.5%. And they tend to be higher as a percent of sales for quick service restaurants than for full service restaurants. But this is the reasonable range that the market is determined over a long period of time. Rent coverage, EBITDAR divided by R, is a more sophisticated measure, and the norm here is about 2 times. Okay, that's a pretty safe number. If you grew up like me with a 1.2 debt service coverage ratio, 2 times is a lot fatter and would seem to be a lot safer. Now, there's more volatility in business NOI in EBITDAR than there is in real estate NOI derived from, fixed contract leases, but 2 to 1 is pretty fat. All right. Now, here's another consistency point. What is net operating income in the leases? These are what people call absolute triple net leases. The tenant pays, these are freestanding single tenant properties, so the tenant pays all the expenses direct to the provider. Excuse me. The tenant is getting the tax bill from the assessor or the collector and paying it direct. It doesn't run through the landlord. The landlord is not calling some maintenance company to sweep the parking lot when it snows. It's all on the tenant. And not only does the tenant pay the operating expenses, they pay the capital replacement of roof, structure, and parking lot. These are long leases. And so the reserves are handled by the tenant. And I get 50 to 100 triple net emails a day, and all of them that advertise a cap rate, it's base rent divided by price. That's, I think, the fact of how the money moves, but that's also how the market discusses this. So how do we reconcile our three rent setting methodologies? Here, if you've ever seen one of our reports, you'll see this chart. This is how we do it. Okay, we have a subject property with sales of $1.6 million, and the EBITDAR on a pre-G&A, pre-CapEx basis is $334,800. Excuse me. And we decided to benchmark to a rent-to-sales ratio of 8% and a rent coverage ratio of 2-to-1. Here's how we do it. The first column here, headed by 8% of sales, utilizes that benchmark. And 8% of $1.6 million is $128,000. That equates to $39 a foot of our building. Of course, it's 8% of sales. We're working our way down this first column. And $128,000 divided into $334,800 is a rent coverage ratio of 2.6 times. Now we move to our second column, headed by coverage of 2-to-1, and we take $334,000 divided by 2, and our rent indication here is $167,000. And that's $50 a foot of building, and 10.5% of sales, and of course 2-to-1 coverage. Our third column, this report will have 10, 15, 20 rent comps in it. Their average is $112,000 a year and $40 a foot. Now, we do not have perfect visibility to the rent to sales and rent coverage ratios of all our comps. We know some of them, and that will appear in the narrative that goes around this table, and we'll discuss them as appropriate. But reconciling our three indications, rent to sales, rent coverage, and rent comps, we select and reconcile to a market rent of $130,000, which is $40, a little over 8%, and about 2.5 times covered. The issue here is one of tension. Okay, there's a tension between the economic thing, the sales and the EBITDAR, the economic thing, and there's tension or conflict with the physical thing. It's our job to reconcile that. We all know of businesses that outperform the real estate or underperform the real estate. And I think of the rent comps expressed per square foot or per year in a physical way. What is the location, age, and quality and condition of my improvements relative to my comps? Where should I be relative to the comps on a physical basis? Then we undertake the economic ratios, and if there's a conflict, we have to reconcile them. But the basic idea here, again, for all of this is, can the tenant afford the rent? USPAP, in their FAQs, the 2018 and 19 edition, number 195, addresses the issue of rent and intangibles, and it basically says even if you have a super evil sale leaseback with what they term to be above market rents and a price that is well above replacement cost, you still don't have any business in that lease. Now, one thing I want to clarify here, again on consistency, don't hear me say that these leases are percentage rents. I distinguish between percentage rent and rent as a percent of sales. If we benchmark a lease to 8% of sales, it's a fixed rent. For the first 5 years of the lease, our rent is $128,000 a year. Then it bumps up 10% every 5 years thereafter. These are fixed leases. Now, if we had a purely percentage rent where every dollar of rent was 8% of every dollar of sales, then we do have some mix of our real estate in our business, no doubt about it. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about percentage rent. We're talking about fixed rent. Now, here I am apologizing for a rent to sales ratio and a rent coverage ratio. It's because of the way I was raised, right? And you were probably raised the same way. But it was about a year ago, 9 months ago, I was in San Francisco speaking at a society event, and I was third on the docket. First up was a co-star economist, and he was talking about housing affordability in the Bay Area. It's bad. Okay, $1 million is the median price of a home in the Bay Area, if I remember right. I think he said this too. Certainly something like this. If you made the median income in the Bay Area and you saved 10% of your income every year, and your goal was to get to a 20% down payment on that median house, it would take you 20 years to get there. It's pretty shocking, right? Next guy up was from CBRE in Sacramento, who had a specialty in low-income housing tax credits. Well, I used to do a bunch of those back in the day, and he talked about that market. It was interesting. It dawned on me. I was sitting there going, Brock, you're apologizing for a rent-to-sales ratio. What are the two markets that we're 100% sure have no business in their real estate? It's single-family homes and apartments. Yet, if you want to buy a home and get a loan, you've got to reveal your income, and somebody will ratio your income to your mortgage payments, your PI and your TI. If you want to rent an apartment, you've got to show them your income, and they will ratio your income to your rent. Wow, think about that. Those two markets are interested in the income of the tenants. Truly, all rent depends upon the income of the tenant. All rent depends upon the income of the tenant. You know, single family and apartments and restaurants and gas stations are smart and sophisticated in their approach to realizing this. The rest of us all need to get on board. That's really the way to look at this, I think. After years of apologizing, I got it completely backwards. This is what makes sense. The reason I'm in a C- office building in a B- suburb in a Midwestern metro is because I don't make as much money as the people in New York in Class A buildings, right? So all rent depends upon the income of the tenant. It's okay. So we got rent, we got our rent, and we got our rent. Okay, let's move on to cap rates. How do we process that rent into a value? Of course, with the cap rate. We get our cap rates from comps. There's lots of comps. And you can find, if you're appraising Taco Bell, you can find lots of Taco Bell cap rates. Not a big deal. There are also surveys that help you track this. Here's the thing I need to say. Okay, this is a matter of highest and best use. Everything I've said up to this point and everything I'll say after has to do with national chain restaurants. If Mar Taco Bell is performing near the average unit volume, that's AUV, of $1.4 million, then the highest and best use is to keep being a Taco Bell. And these methodologies I describe will work. However, there's a whole nother segment to the restaurant market that's not a national chain. And this methodology does not work. The traditional general commercial grids, adjustment grids for rent and for prices and values is what works in the second generation market, we can call it. Okay, you can look at the second generation market as a devolved national chain. Okay, Taco Bell satisfied their lease obligation for 20 years and moved away. Now we're leasing to Jose's Tacos, and if there's rent there, that landlord is accidental. He probably lost his Taco Bell tenant and now has to lease it to Jose, and his hope is that the new business can prove itself well enough to buy the real estate from them. Okay, we're not talking about this methodology for the second generation devolved non-chain stores. So let's go back to our visual model. We've just completed the right side of the chart related to real estate. We've picked a market rent, we've capped it, and we know what our real estate's worth. Let's now work on the left side of our chart and value the business. As I said, the part of income left after paying rent is the excess, works for the business, and here's our left side of our chart. All right, where do we get business multiples come from? They come from comps and from surveys, same as cap rates. Now these are a lot harder to come by, these comps, but they're out there. Here's one thing we need to keep in mind is that the equipment travels with the business. When we multiply our business income by 5 to get a value, inside there is the equipment. And this makes perfect sense when you think about the leases. The premises in the lease is the real estate, just the land in the building. The equipment are the property owned by the tenant. So here's a chart of business multiples. This data comes from a research firm that we pay a bunch of money to, and the major players in the industry subscribe to, and it tells you what multiples are. They slice the market in 8 or 9 different ways. Here's a couple segments: the sandwich segment of quick service and the chicken segment. They do these surveys twice a year. I'm a respondent, and here's a chart. Multiples have been increasing, and they're about 5, and now they're kind of leveling off. 5 times, you'll see in this chart, is what I mentioned up front. So let's go back to our 3 numbers. What are you worth? 5 times. Yes, I own my real estate, 8% capped at 7. Let's plug it into our model. Here are the 3 valuation factors. Let's put in some cash flow. On that example I gave earlier, with $334,000 of EBITDA, we carved off $130,000 for rent, which was 8% of sales and 2.5 times covered. Let's cap it at 7% for a real estate value of $1,850,000. And now here's the most important thing I think that a person could take away from this. All right, if you pour enough scotch in me, I would admit that there's probably a little bit of business, maybe a little bit of business leaked over into our real estate. But we should all take comfort from the left side of this chart. We carved off $130,000 of rent, but we have more than $200,000 of business income left. We have a lot of income left for the business. We have a lot of excess. We don't need to feel that we stole a ton of cash flow or disproportionate amount of cash flow out of the business and put it into the real estate. So multiply our $200,000 of excess earnings by 5, and we get $1 million of business value. And the value of our going concern is $1 million plus $1,850,000, or $2,008,000 something is the value of our going concern in our little scenario here. So people frequently ask me, Brock, what happens if I take it back? I say, heck, I don't know. I'm an appraiser, not an underwriter, but I've been asked enough. I have tried to develop an answer. We have to acknowledge that our Taco Bell has some special features in it, so that if you take it back and you end up selling it to Jose, you're going to lose a lot of money there. And that loss is probably a lot greater than if you took back an industrial building, okay, or a apartment building. So if I were in charge of the world and looking at larger than typical losses, I would want to increase my spreads and decrease my LTV. Right? Makes perfect sense. Get compensated for that risk. Well, as I look at the numbers, I don't really see anybody doing that. I don't think the LTVs and the spreads are terribly different in restaurants than they are in other general commercial property types. The magnitude of loss is greater. The underwriting is the same. So then I must conclude that the frequency of loss is less for restaurants than it isn't for general commercial, for chain restaurants. And that makes some sense because these are well-established brands and businesses, and I doubt that they go bad that often as relative to other property types. So I want to emphasize this point of market segmentation again and say that everything I've talked about here is for a national chain restaurant. There are 290,000 of those in America. There's a larger number, 340,000, that are independent. And really the term of art, the lingo, is emerging concepts or local concepts. The one-off stores are concepts and a counterpoint to chain. And we can use this methodology of the 3 factors for chains, and we tend to not use them for the local concepts. So wrapping up, You need to do what Brock did, please, and what Neo did. This is from the movie Matrix. If you're a nerd, you may remember Neo had to jump across the street from one very tall building to the top of another very tall building. And Morpheus, his mentor, said to him just before he leaped, he said, Neo, free your mind. That's what we need to do as appraisers. Set aside our training and realize that in this market, the business income isn't evil, and the target is affordability when we talk about these things. What happened for me was when I ran into these issues, ultimately the better part of my training as an appraiser came to the fore as a market observer. And if I interviewed enough market participants, I would see what they're doing and the wisdom of it. So I wish I could take your questions right now. I don't believe I can. Email me. Please email me. Call me. Here's my email address. There's a citation on the article I wrote that goes into a little more detail. But I'd be happy to help you out in any way I can. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. And take it away, Brenda. I bet you're the MC at this point. So thank you very much.